The ferry smelled of diesel and wet rope. It coughed away from the mainland as the sun slid down behind a bank of clouds, and the six of them stood shoulder to shoulder on the deck like a single, uneasy silhouette. The island rose from the sea as a dark promise, a wedge of rock crowned with pines, a white house perched on the cliff like a tooth. None of them spoke for a long time. The silence was not empty. It was full of things they had not said in years. Maya kept her duffel close, fingers worrying the strap. She had been the first to suggest the reunion, an attempt to stitch a year of distance into a weekend. She had a way of making plans sound like absolution. Rafi laughed too loudly at the ferry's engine, as if noise could drown the tightness in his chest. Aisha watched the shoreline with a stillness that made the others look away. Bilal carried a bottle wrapped in a paper bag and a ledger in his jacket. He had always been the one who kept accounts, even when the numbers were not his to keep. Zara held a camera like a talisman, fingers already composing frames in her head. Omar checked his phone until the battery died, then checked it again, as if the device might cough up a different past. The house was larger than the photos had suggested. 3 stories, clapboard weathered to the color of old bone, windows like dark eyes. A narrow path wound through scrub and stone to a porch that sagged under the weight of years. Inside, the air smelled of dust and lemon oil. They moved through rooms that still held the previous owner's life, books with brittle spines, a chessboard with pieces mid-game, a radio that looked as if it had been waiting for someone to turn it on. They unpacked with the clumsy intimacy of people who had once shared everything and now had to relearn how to share a room. Rafi set up a speaker and played a playlist that had been theirs in college. The music filled the house and made the past feel like a room they could walk back into. They drank wine on the porch until the sky went black and the stars came out like a scattering of small, indifferent witnesses. It was Zara who found the trunk. They had been exploring the attic on a dare, an old habit, a way to prove to themselves that nothing had changed. The trunk was tucked beneath a moth-eaten quilt, its brass latch green with age. Inside were maps, a rusted compass, a stack of postcards tied with twine. At the bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, lay a phone with a cracked screen. It was not connected to any network. The battery was dead. Someone had placed it there deliberately, as if hiding a confession in plain sight. Maya pried the handkerchief away and turned the phone over. There was a smear of dried salt on the back and a sticker with a name half peeled away. When Omar found a charger in a drawer and plugged it in, the screen blinked to life with a single notification. One unsent message. No sender, no timestamp. The message preview read, "If anything happens, don't trust Bilal." The words landed like a stone in a still pond. For a moment, none of them moved. The music from the porch seemed to thin, as if the house itself were listening. Bilal's face went pale. He laughed, a sound that did not reach his eyes. "It's a prank," he said. "Someone left it here to freak us out." "Who would do that?" Rafi asked, but his voice had lost its bravado. Aisha's jaw tightened. "Whoever left it knew we'd come," she said. "They knew we'd look," they argued until the storm came. The weather arrived like a punctuation mark, wind that made the windows rattle, rain that hammered the roof. The bridge to the mainland, a narrow causeway that had been passable at low tide, was swallowed by the sea. Their phones found only voicemail. The generator coughed and died, and the house settled into a darkness that felt less like absence and more like a presence. That night, they sat in the parlor with candles and the phone between them. The unsent message was a hinge. It swung open a door they had all kept closed. Old stories surfaced, small betrayals, careless cruelties, debts that had been paid with silence. They spoke in fragments at first, then in longer, sharper sentences. The island seemed to listen and take notes. Bilal spoke of a loan he had guaranteed for a friend who had vanished with the money. Omar admitted to a lie that had cost someone a job. Rafi confessed to a night of drunken cruelty that had left a woman hospitalized. Maya, who had suggested the reunion, said nothing about the thing she had been carrying, a file of emails she had printed and folded into her suitcase, evidence of a business deal gone wrong, names circled in red. Zara's camera clicked in the dark, a small mechanical heartbeat. She had always been the one to document, to make memory into proof. Now her photos felt like evidence in a case that had no judge. When the first scream split the night, it was not the island that made them jump, but the recognition that something had changed irreversibly. They ran toward the sound, hearts hammering, feet slipping on wet boards. The scream came from the cliff path, a raw, animal sound that ended in a silence so complete it was louder than any noise. They found nothing at first, only a towel snagged on a rock, a smear of blood on the sand, a single shoe half buried. The tide had taken the rest. Back in the house, the phone buzzed with a new notification. One new voicemail. Omar pressed play with hands that trembled. A voice, distorted by static, said one sentence and then laughed. "You all know what you did." The laugh was not remorseful. It was a punctuation mark that turned their past into a weapon. They slept in fits and starts, each dream a replay of a moment they had tried to forget. In the morning, the island looked ordinary, seabirds wheeling, sunlight on the waves, but the ordinary had been hollowed out. The bridge was still gone. The generator would not start. The radio, when they finally coaxed it to life, offered only static and a single, faint broadcast, a weather warning and a voice that said, almost as an afterthought, no rescue for 48 hours. 48 hours. The number settled over them like a deadline. It made the unsent message heavier. It made the missing shoe a proof of intent rather than an accident. It made every glance between them a question. They began to search the house more thoroughly, as if the walls might cough up a motive. In the study behind a false panel, Maya found a cassette tape labeled in a handwriting she recognized. The label read, "Confession." When they played it, the voice that came through was familiar and raw. It named names. It described a night that none of them wanted to revisit. It ended with a sentence that made the room tilt. "If you think you can bury this, you're wrong." The tape did not tell them who had left the phone in the attic. It did not tell them who had screamed on the cliff. It did not tell them who would be next. It only confirmed what they had always suspected. The past was not finished with them. Outside, the wind picked up. The house creaked like a living thing. Inside, 6 friends sat in a circle and realized that the weekend they had planned as a healing had become a reckoning. The island had closed its gates. The secret had begun to speak. Morning came like a slow bruise. The wind had not let up. It pushed the sea into white teeth and rattled the shutters until the house felt as if it might lift from its foundations. They moved through the rooms with the careful politeness of people who had been friends once and were trying to remember how. Each step seemed to echo with the tape's voice, and every glance carried the weight of the unsent message. They divided tasks as if chores could restore order. Omar and Bilal checked the generator again, fingers greasy with oil and frustration. Zara and Rafi walked the cliff path, cameras and flashlights in hand, scanning for footprints or anything the tide had missed. Maya and Aisha stayed in the house, sorting through the trunk's contents and the stack of postcards, trying to find a pattern where none seemed to exist. Maya unfolded a postcard that showed the island in summer, children on the beach, a sailboat in the distance. On the back, in a looping hand, someone had written a single line. "We thought we could bury it." The ink had bled slightly from exposure to salt. Maya's stomach tightened. She had been the one to bring the printed emails, the one who had hoped that evidence would be a kind of absolution. Instead, the postcards felt like a chorus of witnesses. Sisha found a ledger tucked behind a false drawer in the study. The pages were filled with names and numbers, entries that stopped abruptly 6 months ago. Some names were crossed out. Others had notes in the margins: paid, settled, callback. Bilal's name appeared more than once, but so did others: a lawyer, a landlord, a woman whose name made Aisha's throat close. The ledger suggested transactions, favors, debts repaid in ways that were not always legal. When Omar and Bilal returned from the generator, they carried with them a new worry. The boat moored in the cove had been cut loose. The rope had been severed cleanly as if by a blade. Whoever had done it had known the tide schedule. Whoever had done it had planned for them to be stranded. The accusation that had been a whisper the night before hardened into something sharper. Rafi, who had been loudest in denial, began to look smaller in the doorway. He kept rubbing his hands together, a nervous habit that made the others watch him like a man pacing a cage. Bilal's ledger made him a target. Maya's emails made her a suspect in someone else's eyes. The unsent message, "Don't trust Bilal," had become a lens through which every action was refracted. They tried to make sense of motive. Old grievances surfaced: a failed startup that had left investors ruined, a car accident that had been blamed on a drunk driver, a scholarship revoked because of a forged recommendation. Each memory was a splinter that fit into the larger wound. They argued in fits and starts, voices rising and falling like the tide outside. Zara, who had always been the observer, began to notice patterns in the photos she had taken. In one frame, a shadow fell across the porch at an angle that did not match the sun. In another, a figure stood at the edge of the cliff, blurred as if in motion. She printed the images and pinned them to the wall, creating a map of suspicion. The camera, which had once been a tool for preserving joy, now served as a ledger of presence and absence. By midday, the house had split into factions. Maya and Aisha sat at the kitchen table, whispering over the postcards and the ledger. Omar paced the study, hands in his pockets, muttering about responsibility. Bilal retreated to his room and locked the door. Rafi wandered the property, sometimes stopping to stare at the sea as if it might answer him. Zara moved between them all, her camera hanging like a pendulum. The second scream came in the late afternoon, a sound that tore through the house and left a ringing silence in its wake. This time they did not run blindly. They moved with purpose, flashlights cutting through the rain, voices calling names. The cliff path was slick. The rocks gleamed like black teeth. They found a smear of blood on a boulder and a scrap of fabric caught on a thorn bush. Zara's camera strap torn. Panic sharpened into accusation. Bilal's door was forced open. He stood in the doorway, eyes wide, hands empty.
"I didn't do it," he said, voice raw. "I swear I didn't do it." "You were the only one who had a ledger that could make someone angry enough to—" Omar began, but Maya cut him off. "Stop," she said.
Her voice was small but steady. "We are not going to turn on each other without proof." Proof, however, was a scarce commodity. The tape had named names, but it had not named a killer. The phone's unsent message had pointed a finger, but it had not offered a motive. The ledger suggested transactions. The postcards hinted at guilt. The island offered only weather and cliffs and the slow, indifferent turning of the tide as night fell. They barricaded the doors and windows with furniture, an absurd attempt at safety that made them feel like children building forts. They took turns keeping watch, each rotation a test of nerves. The house creaked and sighed around them, and every shadow seemed to hold a face. During his watch, Omar found a note tucked under the radio, a single line written in the same looping hand as the postcard. "You can run, but you can't hide from what you did." The handwriting was familiar in a way that made Omar's stomach drop. It matched a signature on one of the emails Maya had printed. The note was a confirmation that someone had been watching them, knew their pasts, and had chosen this place to make them pay. Sleep came in short, exhausted bursts. Dreams were populated by the faces of people they had wronged, and the echo of the tape's laugh. In the morning, they would have to decide whether to stay and wait for rescue or try to cross the sea themselves. The boat was gone. The bridge was gone. The weather forecast promised more storms. The ledger and the postcards and the tape had turned their reunion into a courtroom without a judge. When dawn broke, it brought with it a new discovery, a shallow grave dug into the sand below the lighthouse, recently disturbed. They found a handkerchief, Maya's handkerchief, the one she had wrapped around the phone in the attic. The sight of it half buried in the sand made something inside Maya go cold. The phone had not been left by chance. It had been planted, and someone had wanted them to find it. The island had become a stage, and they were the actors in a play written by someone who knew every line. The question was no longer who had started this, but who would finish it. The rain came in sheets that blurred the world into watercolor smears. Inside the house, the light was thin and yellow. Outside, the sea hammered the cliffs like a fist. They moved through the day with the mechanical efficiency of people who had decided to survive long enough to argue again. Each small task, boiling water, mending a shutter, checking the radio, felt like a vote for staying alive. They had begun to mark time in odd ways, the number of candles burned, the pages of the ledger they had read, the photographs Zara printed and pinned to the wall. The wall had become a map of suspicion, faces circled, arrows drawn, dates underlined. It was a collage of memory and accusation that made the house feel less like a refuge and more like a courtroom. Maya woke early and sat on the porch with a mug of coffee gone cold. She watched the sea and tried to remember why she had thought this reunion would heal anything. The printed emails in her bag were a promise she had not yet fulfilled. She had brought them to force a reckoning, to make the others see what she had seen. Now the emails felt like tinder. She had wanted truth. She had not wanted the truth to be a weapon. Aisha moved through the rooms like a shadow, listening more than speaking. She had always been the quiet one, the friend who kept secrets because she believed secrets were a kind of mercy. But the ledger and the tape had changed her. Mercy felt dangerous now. She had begun to keep a small notebook in her pocket, writing down what each person said, not to betray them, but to remember who had admitted what when the fog of fear made memories unreliable. Bilal had stopped sleeping. He paced his room, fingers tracing the ledger's margins as if the ink might rearrange itself into an explanation. He had always been practical. Numbers, accounts, the tidy logic of ledgers. But the ledger in the house was not his alone. It contained entries that implicated others, and the more he read, the more he realized that his neat world had been built on favors and compromises that had become moral quicksand. Rafi had become a live wire. He moved too fast, spoke too loud, tried to fill silence with jokes that landed like stones. The guilt he carried was a raw thing. Sometimes it leaked out in confessions that he tried to laugh off. He had been the drunk that night years ago, the one who had crossed a line and then pretended it had never happened. The tape had named him. The ledger had not, but the postcards and the notes had a way of pointing without saying. Zara kept photographing everything. Her camera had become a talisman and a trap. She took pictures of the wall, the ledger, the shoreline, the footprints in the sand. In the dark room of the parlor, she developed images with hands that trembled. One print surprised her. A close-up of the attic trunk taken the night before showed a smear on the handkerchief that, when magnified, looked like a fingerprint. It was partial, but it was something. She pinned the print to the wall and circled it in red. Omar tried to be the steady one, the friend who could broker peace. But steadiness had a limit. He had lied once to protect someone. That lie had rippled outward and hurt someone else. The tape had named him as well, and the knowledge of his own culpability made him defensive in ways that surprised him. He found himself arguing not to deny guilt, but to control the narrative, an attempt to keep the past from becoming a weapon in someone else's hands. They decided to search the island systematically. If someone had planned this, there might be more clues, places where things had been hidden, messages left like breadcrumbs. They split into pairs, Zara and Rafi to the North Cliffs, Omar and Bilal to the boathouse and cove, Maya and Aisha to the lighthouse and the old caretaker's cottage. The lighthouse was a squat, stubborn thing, its paint flaking like old skin. Inside, the spiral stairs smelled of salt and oil. At the top, the glass was smeared with rain. Below, the keeper's log lay open on a shelf. The log was dated years back, but someone had added a recent entry in a different hand. They came back.
We warned them.
We told them not to dig. The entry was unsigned. Maya's hands went cold. She had not told anyone about the file she had printed, about the forged recommendation that had cost a woman a scholarship, about the email chain that had been doctored to hide a mistake. The log's line felt like a mirror held up to her. Someone else had known enough to write a warning. Someone else had been watching. At the boathouse, Omar and Bilal found evidence of a struggle, scuffed boards, a rope frayed in a way that suggested it had been cut with intent, not wear. In the sand nearby, a set of footprints led toward the rocks and then stopped. The tide had erased the rest. Bilal found a small metal key half buried in the sand, its teeth worn smooth. It fit nothing they could find. Zara and Rafi climbed the north cliffs, flashlights carving cones of light into the rain. Rafi's breath came in short bursts. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be following. At the cliff's edge, they found a shallow alcove where the rock formed a natural shelter. Inside, someone had left a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Zara's hands shook as she unwrapped it. Inside were photographs, old, sun-faded, of the 6 of them at different ages, sometimes with other faces in the background. One photograph showed a man they did not recognize, standing behind them with his hand on Maya's shoulder. On the back of that photo, in the same looping hand as the postcards, was written, "Remember him?" You promised. The photographs were a ledger of memory. They suggested a history that none of them had fully acknowledged. The man in the photo was a hinge they had not expected. He was not in any of their recent memories, but he had been present in the past in ways that mattered now. When they regrouped at the house, the mood had shifted. The island had given them more than fear. It had given them threads. Threads could be followed. Threads could be pulled until the whole fabric unraveled. They spread the photographs on the parlor table and began to talk in a way that felt like excavation. Names surfaced. A local man who had worked odd jobs on the island years ago. A caretaker who had disappeared. A fisherman who had been seen arguing with one of them at a bar the summer after graduation. Each memory was a small lamp that lit a corner of the past. Aisha, who had been quiet, spoke up with a voice that surprised them. "Promised him something," she said. "Not all of us remember it the same way, but I remember the night. We thought we were protecting ourselves.
We thought we were protecting him.
We buried it because we thought it would keep us safe." The room went very still. The tape's laugh seemed to echo in the rafters. Maya's face went white. "We promised to keep quiet," she said. "We promised to cover for him, but we didn't keep our promise. We let him go. We let him take the fall." Bilal's hands clenched.
"Who was he?" he asked.
"Why would someone come back now?" Rafi's voice was small. "Maybe he didn't come back. Maybe someone who remembers him did." They argued until the rain slowed to a drizzle and the tide pulled back a little, revealing more of the shoreline. The photographs had given them a direction, but not a culprit. The ledger, the tape, the postcards, the phone, each piece fit into a pattern that suggested someone had been wronged and had decided to make them pay. That night, they agreed to a new rule. No one would move alone. They would sleep in pairs, keep watch in shifts, and share everything they found. It was a fragile pact, but it was something. Trust, they realized, could be rebuilt in small acts. At 2 in the morning, during Omar's watch, he heard a soft scraping at the back door. He rose, heart thudding, and moved toward the sound with a flashlight. The beam caught a figure hunched against the wall, wet, shivering, and very much alive. For a moment Omar thought it was one of them who had slipped outside. Then the figure lifted its head. It was the man from the photograph. He looked older than the photo, his hair threaded with grey, his face weathered by wind and salt. His eyes, however, were the same, sharp, tired, and full of something like accusation. "You left me," he said, voice low and steady. "You left me to drown in what you did." The house seemed to tilt. The past had arrived at their doorstep, not as a rumor, but as a person who remembered everything. He smelled of sea and old smoke, as if the wind had kept him and the world had not. Up close, the man's face was a map of weather and worry, a thin scar along his jaw, a small crescent of white in one eyebrow, eyes that did not blink as if blinking might let something slip away. He wore a coat that had once been dark and was now the color of wet driftwood. "You left me," he said again, and the words were not an accusation so much as a fact that had finally been spoken aloud. They crowded around him in the kitchen, the light from the single lamp making halos on the wet floorboards.
Rain tapped the windows like a metronome.
The man's hands were steady as he folded them on the table. "My name is Harris," he said. "I worked here."
I kept the place. I knew things. He paused, and in that pause the house seemed to hold its breath.
"You promised me you'd keep quiet. You promised you'd help. You promised you'd be there." Maya felt the room tilt. The photograph in the alcove, the hand on her shoulder, Harris's hand, came back to her like a memory that had been waiting to be remembered. She had been 22 then, reckless with loyalty. She had signed a paper she had not read. She had told herself she was protecting a friend. The ledger, the tape, the postcards, each had been a way to avoid saying his name. "What happened to you?" Aisha asked, voice small. Harris's mouth tightened. "You left me to take the fall," he said. "You let them say I was the one who stole. You let them say I was the one who took the money. You let them say I was the one who hurt her." He looked at each of them in turn. "You left me to rot." Bilal's face went ashen. "We didn't," he began, but Harris cut him off. "You didn't do anything," Harris said.
You made choices.
"You made them for yourselves. You thought the truth would stay buried."
You thought the sea would keep its mouth shut? Rafi's hands trembled.
"We were kids," he said. "We panicked. We thought." "You thought," Harris repeated. "You thought."
And I paid. The room filled with a silence that was not empty, but full of the weight of what had been done.
The tape's laugh echoed in Maya's head, a sound that had once been a punctuation mark and now felt like a verdict. Harris told them what had happened after the photograph was taken. He had been accused of theft from the island's caretaker fund, a petty crime that had been made monstrous by rumor. He had been arrested, questioned, and released with a warning, but the stain had stuck. The man who had been their friend, someone they had promised to protect, had been forced to leave the island. He had drifted for years, doing odd jobs, sleeping in harbors, always with the knowledge that his name had been used as a shield. "You promised to help me," Harris said. "You promised to tell the truth if anyone asked. You promised to stand up. You promised to be my friends." Maya's hands were cold. She had printed emails that proved a different version of events, proof that could have cleared Harris if it had been used differently. She had thought the reunion would be a place to confess, to hand over the evidence and let the law do its work. Instead, the evidence had become a weapon in someone else's hands. "Why now?"
Omar asked.
"Why come back now after all these years?" Harris's eyes flicked to the window where the sea roared. "Because I heard you were coming," he said.
Because someone told me you would be here.
"Because I wanted to see if you would keep your promise." Zara, who had been quiet until then, stepped forward with a photograph in her hand, the one with Harris behind them, his hand on Maya's shoulder.
"Who wrote these?"
she asked. "Who left the phone? Who left the tape?" Harris's jaw tightened. "I didn't," he said. "I didn't come back to play judge. I came back to ask for what was promised. But someone else has been doing the judging for me." The confession tape, the unsent message, the postcards. Harris listened as if each were a sentence in a story he had only just been given. When they finished, he rubbed his forehead and let out a long breath. "There are people who remember better than I do," he said. "There are people who keep lists. There are people who keep ledgers. Someone has been keeping score." Bilal's face went white. "The ledger," he began. "The ledger," Harris echoed.
"I saw it when I came ashore. I saw the names. I saw the numbers. I saw the way favors had been traded like currency. I saw that someone had been keeping track of who owed what." Aisha's notebook lay open on the table.
She had been writing down confessions, fragments of memory, the things people admitted in the dark. She read aloud a line she had written the night before. "We promised to bury it. We promised to protect him. We promised to never speak of it again." Harris's eyes softened for a moment. "Promises are heavy things," he said. "They can be anchors or they can be chains." They argued then, not about what had happened years ago, but about what to do now. Maya wanted to hand over the emails to Harris and let him decide. Omar wanted to call the mainland and demand rescue. Rafi wanted to leave, to run back to the life that had not yet been touched by the island's reckoning. Bilal wanted to hide the ledger, to deny its existence. Zara wanted to document everything and let the photographs speak. Harris listened and then said something that made the room go very still. "There is someone else here," he said. "Someone who remembers more than any of you. Someone who has been keeping the ledger and the postcards and the tape. Someone who has been deciding who pays." They looked at one another as if the answer might be written on each face. The idea that one of them might be orchestrating the terror was a blade that cut through the fragile truce they had built. Trust, already frayed, began to unravel. "You think one of us would do this?" Maya whispered. Harris's gaze moved slowly around the circle.
"I don't think," he said.
"I know that promises can be broken in many ways.
I know that people can be both victim and perpetrator. I know that the sea keeps secrets, but sometimes the sea is only a mirror." Outside, the wind rose.
The house seemed to lean into the storm, as if listening for the next sound. Inside, 6 friends and 1 man they had wronged sat in a circle and realized that the past had not only returned, it had come with a plan. Harris sat at the kitchen table as if he had always belonged there, as if the years of absence had been a brief errand. The rain kept time against the roof. The lamp threw a small pool of light over the ledger and the photographs and the phone with its unsent message. Outside, the sea kept its own counsel. "You could have come sooner," Maya said, and the words were sharper than she intended. They carried the weight of years and the ache of promises unkept. Harris's mouth tightened.
"I tried," he said. "I wrote letters.
I went to the magistrate.
I asked for help."
But when you are the story people tell to make themselves feel better, the truth is a hard thing to sell. Bilal's hands were clenched on the table. "We didn't," he began, and then stopped, because the sentence had no finish that would make him feel clean. "You didn't do anything," Harris said.
"You made choices.
You chose yourselves." Aisha folded her arms around herself. "We were scared," she said.
We were young."
"We thought we were protecting someone." "You protected yourselves," Harris replied. "You protected your futures. You let me be the one who paid." Rafi, who had been pacing, stopped and leaned against the counter. "We were idiots," he said. "We were drunk. We panicked. We thought it would blow over." Harris looked at him with a kind of pity that made Rafi flinch.
"Pity is not what I want," he said.
"I want what was promised." Maya reached into her bag and pulled out the printed emails. The paper felt heavier than it should have. She had imagined this moment 100 times, handing over the proof, watching Harris's name cleared, letting the law do what it was supposed to do. Now the papers felt like a confession she had not yet earned the right to give. "Give them to me," Harris said.
"Let me see." Maya hesitated, then slid the stack across the table.
Harris read quickly, his eyes moving over the lines with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for this for a long time. When he finished, he folded the papers and put them back in front of her. "These are not enough," he said. "They show a pattern, but they do not show intent. They do not show who decided to bury me. They do not show who profited from my absence." Bilal's face went white. "The ledger," he began. Harris nodded. "The ledger is a map," he said. "It shows favors and debts. It shows who took what and who paid whom back. But a ledger is only useful if someone reads it the right way." Zara, who had been quiet, stepped forward and placed the photograph of the man with his hand on Maya's shoulder on the table. "Who is he?" she asked.
"Why was he with us?"
"Why did we promise him anything?" Harris's jaw tightened.
"His name was Farid," he said.
"He worked the docks. He helped with odd jobs. He was kind to us when we were careless. We promised him we would be there. We promised we would not let him be the scapegoat." Aisha's face crumpled. "We thought we were protecting him," she said. "We thought if we kept quiet the worst would pass." "And it did pass," Harris said.
"For you."
"Not for him." The room was full of a silence that felt like a held breath. Each of them had a private ledger of guilt that no one else could read. The island had become a place where those ledgers were being compared and weighed. "Someone has been orchestrating this," Omar said suddenly. "The phone, the tape, the postcards. Someone has been putting pieces in place. Someone wanted us to find them." Harris's eyes narrowed. "Someone wanted you to remember," he said. "Someone wanted you to feel the weight of what you did." "Who?"
Rafi demanded.
"Who would do that?" Harris's gaze moved slowly around the room. "Someone who remembers better than you do," he said. "Someone who kept a ledger of their own." Bilal's face hardened.
"You think one of us is doing this?"
he asked. Harris did not answer directly.
Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded piece of paper.
He placed it on the table and unfolded it with careful fingers. The paper was a receipt, old, water-stained, stamped with a date. It bore a name they all recognized, the name of the woman whose scholarship had been revoked, the woman whose life had been derailed by a forged recommendation. Maya's throat closed. "We didn't," she began, but the sentence again had no clean ending. "You did," Horace said. "Not all of you, perhaps, but enough of you."
And someone kept track. Zara picked up the receipt and traced the ink with a finger.
"This was paid," she said. "Someone paid to make the record disappear." "Someone paid to make the story fit," Harris said. "Someone paid to make sure the right person took the fall." The house seemed to lean in, listening. The rain had slowed to a steady drum. The tide had pulled back, revealing more of the shoreline, more of the rocks that had once been hidden. The island was a place that revealed things slowly, like a tide exposing a wreck. "Who benefits?" Omar asked. "Who would gain from this?" Harris's eyes were steady. "Someone who needed a clean slate," he said. "Someone who needed to erase a debt. Someone who needed to make sure their name stayed clean." Bilal's hands trembled. "You think it's one of us?" he said. "You think one of us is orchestrating this to get revenge or to balance the books," Harris finished. "To make sure the scales tip the way they should." Aisha's notebook lay open on the table. She had been writing down everything, confessions, fragments, the things people said in the dark. She read aloud an entry she had written the night before. Bilal paid the landlord off. Omar lied to cover a mistake. Rafi was drunk. Maya printed the emails. Zara took the photos. Aisha kept the secrets. The list hung in the air like a verdict. Bilal's face crumpled.
"I did what I had to," he said.
"I paid to keep things quiet."
"I thought it would be temporary. I thought it would be over." "You thought," Harris said. "You thought Rafi's voice was small.
If one of us is doing this, why not just tell us? Why not come clean? Harris's mouth twisted. Because confession is not always enough, he said. Because some debts are not paid with words. Because someone wanted you to feel the cost, they argued, until the lamp guttered and the house settled into a brittle quiet. Each of them retreated into their own thoughts, the private arithmetic of guilt and fear. Outside, the sea breathed in and out, indifferent. At dawn, when the sky was a thin grey, Zara found something in the darkroom that made her blood run cold. A new photograph, wet and still developing, left on the tray as if placed there by invisible hands. It showed the parlour table from the night before, papers, photographs, the ledger, and in the corner of the frame, barely visible, a hand holding a pen on the back of the print, in the same looping hand as the postcards and the lighthouse log. Someone had written a single line, "You promised him. Now pay." The handwriting was familiar in a way that made Maya's stomach drop. It matched the signature on one of the emails she had printed. The island had not only returned the past, it had begun to collect its price. They slept in fits and starts that night, each pair taking turns to watch the house and the sea. The storm had eased to a steady, sullen rain that made the windows look like sheets of glass smeared with oil. Outside, the island breathed in and out, indifferent. Inside, the house felt like a lung that had been filled with smoke. When dawn came, it was a thin, grey thing. The tide had pulled back further than before, revealing a strip of black sand and a scatter of objects the sea had spat up, a length of rope, a rusted tin, a child's shoe. The bridge to the mainland remained submerged. The radio crackled with the same blunt message, no rescue for 48 hours, and then fell silent. They gathered in the parlour with the ledger spread like an accusation across the table. Hari sat with them, a quiet presence who had become both witness and judge. The photographs were pinned to the wall in a chaotic constellation. The new print with the hand holding a pen had been added to the collage overnight. Its message, "You promised him. Now pay," a punctuation mark that made the air taste metallic. "We need to be honest," Harris said. His voice was steady, the kind of steadiness that comes from having nothing left to lose. If someone is orchestrating this, we need to know who benefits. We need to know who had motive, means, and the patience to plan it. They began to speak in a way that felt like excavation, each confession a small shovel scraping away at the surface. Maya told the story of the forged recommendation and the email she had printed. She admitted she had once thought the truth could be a currency to trade for absolution. Bilal confessed to paying off a landlord and to arranging favors that had been meant to smooth things over but had only buried consequences deeper. Omar admitted to lying to cover a mistake that had cost someone a job. Rafi, voice raw, described the night he had been drunk and cruel and the way they had all agreed to say nothing. Zara spoke of the photographs she had taken and the guilt she felt for turning memory into evidence. Aisha read from her notebook the small, precise entries that had become a ledger of confessions. Harris listened and then said, "Someone has been keeping a ledger of a different kind. Not the ledger of money, but the ledger of memory.
Someone who remembers every slight, every favor, every betrayal.
Someone who has been waiting for you to return." They looked at one another. The idea that one of them might be the architect of their torment had been a blade they had avoided naming.
Now it hovered between them like a threat. Who would want to do this?
Omar asked.
Who would want to make us suffer like this?
Harris's eyes were steady. "Someone who lost everything because of you," he said. "Someone who watched their life unravel while you moved on." They went through the list of people they had wronged, names they had tried to forget. The woman whose scholarship had been revoked, the landlord who had been paid off, the man who had been accused of theft, the woman who had been hurt the night Rafi had been drunk. Each name was a small stone that could be thrown to make ripples. Zara spread the photographs again and pointed to a face that had been in the background of several images. A woman with a narrow face and a scar at the corner of her mouth. She had been at the edge of their memories, a presence that had been easy to ignore. On the back of one photograph, in the same looping hand that had written the postcards and the lighthouse log, was a single word: remember. Maya's hands went cold. "Her name is Syra," she said. "She was the one who lost the scholarship. She wrote to me once, begging me to fix it."
I ignored her.
Bilal's face crumpled. "I paid the landlord to keep quiet," he said.
I thought it would be over. I didn't know it would become a ledger. Harris's jaw tightened.
"Syra had a life that was derailed," he said. "She had a child. She lost a job. She had to move away. She remembers. Some people remember with anger. Some remember with patience. Some remember and plan." They set out to find Syra, to confront the person whose life had been most visibly altered by their choices. The island offered few places to hide. The rain had washed footprints into a grey smear. They searched the cottages and the scrub, the boathouse and the lighthouse, calling her name until their voices were hoarse. They found her at the far end of the island, sitting on a rock with her back to the sea. She was thinner than the photograph suggested, her hair pulled into a tight knot, a scarf wrapped around her shoulders. When she turned, her face was a map of endurance, the scar at the corner of her mouth, eyes that had learned to measure people quickly. "You came," she said, and there was no surprise in her voice, only a tired acceptance. Maya stepped forward, the printed emails in her hand like a confession. "Syra," she said.
Syra held up a hand. "Don't," she said.
"I know what you want to say."
"I know the words you will use."
"I have been waiting for years for you to say them. But words are not what I need. What do you need?" Bilal asked, voice small. Syra's eyes flicked to the house and then back to them. "I needed someone to remember me when it mattered," she said.
"I needed someone to stand up when it would have cost them something. I needed someone to tell the truth when it would have hurt their future." Harris stepped forward.
"We promised you," he said. "We promised to keep you safe." "You promised," Syra echoed. "But promises are only as good as the people who keep them."
"I was left with the consequences. I had to rebuild my life from the pieces you left behind." They argued then, not about the past, but about responsibility.
Syra listened, and then said something that made the air go still.
"I did not come here to kill you," she said.
"I did not come here to make you suffer for the sake of suffering."
"I came because someone else was doing that for me." They looked at one another.
The idea that Syra might be innocent of the orchestrations they had endured was a relief and a new confusion. "Who?" Maya asked. Syra's gaze moved slowly around the group. "Someone who had a ledger of their own," she said. "Someone who kept track of favors and debts and decided to balance the books in blood." They returned to the house with Syra and Harris, the six of them, and the two people whose lives had been most affected by their choices. The ledger lay on the table like a map of culpability. The new photograph with the hand and the pen had been pinned to the wall. The postcards and the tape and the unsent message were all pieces of a puzzle that had become a weapon. They began to look at one another with a new clarity. Small details that had seemed insignificant now took on weight. The way Omar had been defensive when the ledger was mentioned. The way Rafi had been jittery and quick to anger. The way Bilal had been secretive about payments. The way Maya had kept the emails as a private currency. The way Zara had photographed everything, and then seemed to flinch when the images were used as evidence. It was Zara who noticed the pattern first. She had been going through the ledger again, tracing names and dates, when she found a series of entries that did not match the rest. They were written in a different hand, neater, more deliberate, and they recorded small, precise favors: paid to silence, arranged meeting, receipt issued. The entries were not about money alone. They were about control. "Look," she said, pointing. "These entries are different. They're not Bilal's handwriting. They're not any of ours." Harris leaned in. They're the same hand as the postcards, he said. The same looping script. Maya's stomach dropped. She had seen that hand before, on the back of the photograph, on the lighthouse log, on the new print.
It was the hand that had been writing messages to them, the hand that had been orchestrating the reminders. Who writes like that?
Omar asked. They spread the ledger and the photographs and the postcards and began to compare handwriting. The looping script matched a name none of them had expected. Farid, the man who had been in the photograph with Haris, the man who had once worked the docks and who had disappeared years ago. Farid had been a quiet presence in their youth, someone who had helped them and then vanished when trouble came. He had been the one who had been accused of theft, the one who had been forced to leave. They had promised to help him and had not. Farid had been the hinge in their past. Farid is dead, Rafi said, voice small. We buried that.
We thought Harris's face was unreadable.
We buried him in more ways than one, he said. But someone kept his ledger. Someone kept his memory. They followed the trail of handwriting and found a small, hidden notebook tucked behind a loose board in the attic. The notebook was a ledger of a different kind. Names, dates, favors, and a series of short, precise notes that read like a tally. At the back of the notebook was a single line written in the looping hand, balance due. Collecting now. The handwriting matched the postcards, the lighthouse log, the photograph note, and the new print. The ledger was not Bilal's, it was not any of theirs. It belonged to someone who had been keeping score for
years. They realized then that the orchestrator had not been one of them, but someone
who had been watching them from the margins, someone who had taken Farid's memory and turned it into a ledger of vengeance. The person had used their guilt as a tool, planting clues and reminders to make them remember, to make them feel the cost. The question shifted from who among them had done this to who had the patience and the knowledge to plan it. The handwriting suggested a careful mind. The placement of the phone in the attic, the cutting of the boat rope, the staged photographs, all required someone who knew the island and knew them. Syra's eyes narrowed. There's someone else, she said.
Someone who knew Farid and who knew you.
Someone who had access to your lives. They thought of the people they had wronged beyond their circle. The landlord, the lawyer, the woman who had been hurt, the caretaker who had disappeared. One name kept surfacing in their memories. A man who had been a quiet presence in the background of their youth. Jamal, a local who had been close to Farid, who had been seen arguing with him the summer after graduation. They found traces of Jamal in the ledger, an entry here, a note there. He had been a man who kept accounts of a different kind, grudges, favors, and the slow arithmetic of revenge. He had the motive, the knowledge, and the patience. They set out to find Jamal, following footprints and rumors and the thin trail the island allowed. The search led them to a small, hidden cove where the rocks formed a natural shelter. There, in a shallow cave, they found a makeshift camp and a stack of papers tied with twine. The papers were Jamal's ledger, names, dates, receipts, and a careful, looping hand that matched the postcards and the photograph notes. Jamal was not there. He had left, but his ledger remained like a confession. In the camp they found a photograph of Jamal with Farid, both younger, both smiling. On the back of the photograph, in Jamal's hand, was written, "He promised." We kept score. They understood then the shape of the plan. Jamal had taken Farid's memory and turned it into a ledger of debts. He had decided to collect, not with words, but with fear. He had orchestrated the phone, the tape, the postcards, and the staged clues to make them remember and to make them pay. He had used the island as a stage because it was a place that held memory and because it could be cut off from the world. They returned to the house with the ledger and the photograph and a new clarity. The storm had passed. The tide had turned. The bridge to the mainland was visible again, a thin line of rock that would be passable at low tide. They had hours before the sea closed the path once more. They gathered their things and the evidence and set out to find Jamal, to confront the man who had turned memory into a weapon. The walk to the cove was a slow, deliberate thing. Each step felt like a vote for something: justice, mercy, survival. They found Jamal at the edge of the cove, a silhouette against the grey sea. He was older than the photograph suggested, his hair white at the temples, his hands stained with salt and ink. When he turned, his face was a map of patience and something like satisfaction. "You came," he said, and there was no surprise in his voice. Harris stepped forward. "Why?" he asked. "Why do this?" Jamal's eyes were steady. "Because promises were broken," he said. "Because a man named Fareed was left to pay for what you did."
Because I kept his ledger and watched you move on.
"I wanted you to remember."
I wanted you to feel the cost. You could have told us, Maya said.
"You could have asked for justice." Jamal's mouth twisted. "Justice is a slow thing," he said. "It does not always come. I had to make it come faster." They argued until the tide began to pull back, and the path to the mainland revealed itself like a thin, hopeful vein. Jamal's ledger lay open on a rock, the pages fluttering in the wind. He had planned to make them suffer, to balance the books with fear. But as they spoke, something shifted in him. The ledger, once a tool of vengeance, began to look like a confession that had become too heavy to carry. In the end, it was Harris who stepped forward and did something none of them had expected. He offered Jamal the papers Maya had brought, the emails that showed the truth. He offered them not as a bargaining chip, but as a way to close the ledger without more blood. Jamal looked at the papers, then at the faces around him, the people who had been young and careless and who had grown into guilt. He closed the ledger with a slow, deliberate motion. "You wanted me to remember," he said. "I remember.
But I do not want to be the one who kills for memory." They walked back to the house together, the tide at their feet and the sky clearing.
The bridge to the mainland was passable. The radio crackled with a weather update and then, finally, with the sound of a boat engine in the distance. When the rescue boat arrived, it felt like an ending and a beginning at once. They boarded with the ledger and the photographs and the knowledge that their lives would not be the same. Harris and Syra stayed behind on the island, choosing to remain where memory had been both wound and remedy. Jamal handed over his ledger to the authorities when they reached the mainland, a document that would complicate lives and perhaps, in time, make amends. On the ferry back, the six of them sat in a silence that was not empty but full of the work they had to do. They had been forced to remember, to confess, and to face the consequences. The island had been a crucible that burned away pretense and left them with the rawness of truth. Zara's camera, which had once been a talisman, now felt like a tool for accountability. Maya's emails would be used to clear names and to open investigations. Bilal's ledger would be examined and, where necessary, corrected. Omar and Rafi would have to live with the knowledge of what they had done and the people they had hurt.
Aisha's notebook would become a record of confessions that might help rebuild what had been broken. They did not leave the island unscarred.
The memory of the weekend would remain like a seam in their lives, visible, sometimes painful, but a reminder that promises matter. They had been given a reckoning, and they had chosen, imperfectly, to face it. In the months that followed, investigations unfolded. Names were cleared, apologies were made, and some debts were repaid. Not all wounds healed. Some relationships could not be mended. But the ledger that had once been a weapon became, in time, a record that allowed for accountability. The last image Zara took before they left the island was of the house on the cliff, its windows catching the light like small, watchful eyes. In the foreground, the tide had left a single shoe half buried in the sand, a reminder that the sea keeps what it is given, and that some things
cannot be reclaimed. They returned to their lives
with the knowledge that memory is not a thing to be buried lightly. It is a ledger that keeps its own accounts, and sooner or later it asks to be balanced.
Did the story send chills down your spine? And from which city are you tuning in tonight? Let's meet in the comments. If you enjoyed this dark tale, you can support me with a super thanks so I can keep uncovering more gripping true crime stories for you. Thank you so much for your support. It helps me bring even more suspenseful narratives to life. I'm looking forward to your thoughts on this mystery. There's a lot more waiting for you on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. See you in the next chilling story with intrigue and respect.